My name is Jill Crittenden. I have been gone through a career that is, I think, not existent anymore. So when I started out in high school, the model for biologists and neuroscientists was to have many people had very small labs, and they were mostly funded by the National Institute of Health, by the government. And they would publish papers based on experiments that were done only in their own laboratory. I was very passionate about research. My father was a physicist and my brother's a physicist. And so I was pretty aware of what the research environment is like. And I think I knew that it involved a lot of detailed work that often doesn't work very well. And that's certainly something I try to tell young people, that it requires a lot of passion because so many things fail. And so you have to be willing to deal with all the failure because you're so passionate about it that the reward you get makes up for all that failure. And my dad said to me at one point that the good part about that is that, science is so fun that if there wasn't all that failure, then everybody would be trying to do it and it'd be harder to get a job. So that's the silver lining, I guess, of it being such a tough thing to do. Research is a tough thing to do, and discovery is a tough thing to do, often because you're trying to use the latest techniques to really test things again, right? It's easy to come up with ideas for how something works. Testing whether that idea is true and asking the right question is difficult. And you're never quite sure, right? There's always a chance that the way you did the experiment gave you an answer that was spurious, that you thought it answered your question, but there was an artifact or something. And so people are always using the latest techniques to sort of take those questions one step further. And part of what then makes research hard is that you're always trying to use the latest technique, which barely works, right? That's why it's the latest one, because it hasn't been perfected and used over and over again. And so that's part of what makes research a little bit painful, because there's so much failure with the technical parts of it. But I kind of knew that from going into it. As an undergraduate, I got a degree in microbiology at Indiana University, where my father was a professor. And the reason I got a degree in microbiology wasn't really because I wanted to study microbes, but because in those days, the genetics were very well worked out there. And I loved the idea of being able to control biology, right? I loved biology, but I didn't want to just describe how things work. That didn't sound interesting to me. I wanted to be able to test things. And in those days, the genetic engineering was pretty new. And that's a way you can really test things, right? You can take a gene out, you can put a gene in, you can see if it has the effects that you want, rather than just describing, here's how an animal goes about eating. You say, oh, here's the very genetic circuit in these neurons in the brain that control eating. If we turn it off, they stop eating. If we turn it on, they'll eat when they're not hungry. That sort of thing that's really powerful in biology these days. And so I always wanted to know how animals work, how their behaviors worked, how their brains worked. And so when I realized that capability was there, Dad really supported me a lot to become a molecular neuroscientist. And first I went to Cold Spring Harbor labs and began graduate school there. Then my advisor moved to Houston to Baylor College of Medicine, and I followed him, and we worked on fruit flies. And in those days, that was a really powerful genetic organism, and they have learning and memory. They're actually quite complicated animals. They'll, for example, one of the crazy things about fruit flies is that if the females have mated, then they often don't want to mate again, because they could lay eggs, right? So they don't need to mate again. They're going to spend their time figuring out where to lay their eggs, not mating anymore, because they already have fertilized eggs. And so then they'll reject other males. If other males try to court them, they'll be like, no thanks, I'm done. I've got other stuff to do now, family to raise. But the males don't like being rejected. So you can set it up so that males are only exposed to females that have mated. So they get rejected over and over and over again. And those males are more likely to consume alcohol if you give them a choice of how much alcohol versus sugar water to consume than males that haven't been rejected so much. I mean, so there's these things that we think of as being, kind of part of our troubles in life, right?
Yeah.
Human troubles in life, alcoholism and rejection from romantic situations, but they're really these ancient circuits
Yeah.
And so you can test them genetically in fruit flies. But now, when I started graduate school, it was mainly flies that people were doing. But during graduate school, people got more and more resources in mice. And so then I wanted to switch to mice because you could do really fancy manipulations of neuronal recording that was very hard to do in flies because their neurons are so tiny, you can't record the electrical signals, whereas you can in mice quite readily. So I switched to mice as a postdoc. And another faculty member here has gone on to move to genetically modified monkeys. So people, as the techniques get fancier and fancier, you can get closer and closer to really modeling genetic mutations in humans in animals that have pretty high level cognition. So animals that have, more complicated language, like some of the social monkeys do, and say, okay, do they communicate with each other the same if they have the autism gene, those sorts of questions. And then I worked at MIT I started in 2000. So I was here for 20 years doing research on movement disorders in mice, Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease, those types of movements that you voluntarily control, whether you're going to do something or sometimes you lose that control. And then 3 years ago, I took this administrative position, which is termed scientific advisor. There aren't as many of those types of positions as there are to be a postdoc, for example, or a bench scientist. But I really like it. It's nice for my time of life. It allows me to understand a lot more of what the latest research is as my research has become older, as I've become older. And I do a lot of mentorship of young people here in the McGovern Institute.
That's really cool. And then, like you mentioned, like a lot of new technologies. I work in the C. elegans lab right now, and yeah, single cell RNA sequencing. And so everyone in my lab is trying to learn that, and it's a steep curve.
That technique has been amazing. So I think it was in the early 2000s that the government put out a challenge to make the $1,000 genome. So they said, we're going to give grants to people to try to make sequencing of DNA a lot cheaper because they just gotten the human genome and it costs an arm and a leg, right? And they knew that we need to be able to be getting more sequences. And that put the chemists onto it. So it had been more traditionally something biologists were working on, but a bunch of chemists started working on it. And then they developed in parallel a number of much cheaper, faster methods for sequencing. And so now we can do single cell sequencing for very little money. And another interesting aspect of that timing is that now there's a lot of extinction going on, right? There's mass extinction of organisms around the world. And so the ability to sequence all those organisms and all the microbiological organisms is really powerful because then you have that in the bank, right? You know what their genetic sequence was before they disappear from the earth. So a lot of tools are still being made from microorganisms, for example.
How did you find your passion? How do you suggest other people try to find that as well?
I really think for me, a lot of it was just natural. And I think many of us do have natural passions, right? People are really excited about trucks or something from a very early age. They really want to know how trucks work and they end up going into robotics or something like that. For me, I was really passionate about animals. I was always loved seeing how animals acted and trying to figure out why they did what they did. And I think that was a driving force for me. And it just meshed nicely with the fact that I was also really passionate about genetics and how genetics might control animals, and the fact that tools in genetics had become powerful enough that you could do really exciting cause and effect experiments. It's important to try to figure out, what you really like doing that maybe not everybody likes doing. I think that's another important thing. Some people say, well, my passion is to make money, but too many people want to make money, right? That's not a great goal because you've got too much competition. So it's useful to find something that you're passionate about that not everybody likes to do, so that your work isn't drudgery, so that your work is what you think is fun and you can get paid for it because not everybody thinks it's fun. And then find out what's being funded. So for example, I'm really lucky to be in neuroscience because it's heavily funded because there's so many brain diseases that we don't understand. And that people really want to give a lot of money for because there's suffering in their family, for example.
You mentioned that like you help mentor a lot of students. I know that I like feel very lucky to have found like a good mentor pretty early on. How do you suggest a high schooler reach out and like find a mentor?
Well, definitely ask good teachers in your high school if they've got ideas, if they've got connections, either virtual connections or connections at the local university, or see if they will be a mentor for you. I mean, there are really some excellent high school science teachers, right? So that's one place to start. Another place is to try to find online awards and competitions. Olympiads, for example, a lot of those science Olympiads have the judges are scientists. And so if you participate in those competitions, then you can meet the scientists who are judges or the scientists who are mentors. So just search online for that sort of thing. The Dana Foundation has a lot of programming geared towards young people, high school students and middle school students. So look there. There's also a journal called Frontiers for Young Minds, and that is written by scientists for young people. And then the young people are really important. It's a typical peer model of review, just like I would have for my science papers, where the scientist submits a paper, the editor at the Frontiers Journal for Young Minds sends it out to a mentor, and then that mentor has a group of mentees, reviewers who are young people, who are teenagers or maybe even younger than that. And those people read the paper and provide feedback. They say it should be published now, it's ready to go, or more likely here are things that need to be changed about it because it doesn't make sense. The reason that the reviewers are so important is because usually those are written by scientists that don't know how to write for young people. They know how to write their science for their own peers, but they don't know how to write it for young people. And so the feedback that goes to the scientists is really important. And then the scientists change their paper according to what the reviewer said, and then it goes back and then it finally gets published. And so that's another good way to try to get connected with scientists. Find a teacher who wants to connect you with that journal. And also you can get your name in the journal, not your last name, because it has some identity protection, but it's an experience with peer review, which is a major part of being a researcher. And it gives you something you can put on your CV. Normally you don't tell people that you reviewed their paper, but after it's accepted, they will see who reviewed it. And then so you could take that as an opportunity to write to those people and say, would you be willing to meet with me or talk to me about science or whatever kind of mentorship you're looking for? And also the people who publish in that journal are usually people who are doing, primary research at a major institution, and they've been motivated for whatever reason, they're not getting paid to do it, to write up their own research up in a format that's accessible to young people. And so people who are publishing in there are likely to want to be mentors.
What kind of skills can a high schooler develop right now without access to a wet lab?
Computational, it's huge. Knowing coding, how to deal with large data sets. I would say probably the number one thing I hear these days is that your ability to handle large data sets is really important. And that's the kind of thing that you can do quite cheaply, right? You can take Python classes for free and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that's actually what I've been doing. I took a lot of data sets off of GEO, ran them through R. Like working with a lot of students, what makes a student stand out to you? Like how do you pick someone out of a crowd?
Some of my best students have been people who really think deeply about what they're doing and ask questions about it and go and look up papers and have questions about those papers. So they're not just using their hands, they're using their hands and their mind to try to understand, why am I doing this with my hand, right? Somebody teaches you, okay, here's what you're going to do with these brain slices and look at them under the microscope. And they don't only do that, but they also try to understand exactly why they're doing it, why they're doing each step. And also some of my best students have realized problems that we're having, what the solutions are, or even that there are problems where we never even realized that there were problems. So as one example, we had some kind of sampling of mouse behavior, but the mouse behavior was so fast compared to the rate at which the infrared light was detecting their movements that some of the animals, we were mischaracterizing their movements because we didn't have a frequent enough sampling of their behavior. So they were doing behaviors in the interval between the the light detectors temporally. And one of the students recognized that. And that was just invaluable, right? Required a lot of detailed understanding of how the data were being collected and problems that might ensue from the way it was being done.
Yeah, so like understanding mechanisms, so you can like think for yourself, think practically.
Yeah, and if you're doing experiments in the lab, think deeply about what you're doing and why and how it might be done better or how misinterpretations could be made. Often people who are actually doing the experiments, I shouldn't say often, almost always people who are actually doing the experiments have insights that people who are the professors in the laboratory don't have, because the professors have a big sense, right? They have a really strong big picture and a history of everything, but they're not in there to see, oh, the rat keeps moving its tail in this funny way. What does that mean? Well, why is it doing that? If you see something that seems a little bit unusual, think deeply about that, because you might be the only one that notices it, and it might be actually a really important sign.
Yeah, and I think someone told me that science is more from observation than like intent.
Observation is a big part of it. And that's, I mean, the other really important thing about observation is, what's that expression? It favors the prepared mind or something like
Yeah,
that.
something I don't know.
Discovery favors the prepared mind, because things that you discover that are most important usually are things that people didn't expect. Most of the stuff you say, okay, I'm going to test whether, whatever your example is, you're going to test whether if you keep a mouse up all night, is its memory not as good as if we're going to think that probably its memory is not going to be as good as if it got a good night's sleep and didn't eat donuts the day before or something. And then you find it and okay, fine, you showed it was true. But what if it turns out that that mouse keeps digging holes or something weird, like it wasn't even part of your test, right? You were just trying to see whether they remembered something, and all of a sudden you see they're digging holes all the time after they ate the donuts. Why? And then you discover, right, that the donuts are causing them to have some repetitive behavior or something you
Yeah,
didn't expect. And so I think being really observing carefully and paying a lot of attention to things that you didn't expect is the most important way to make discoveries that are the most interesting discoveries.
do you have any other advice for high schoolers?
I think it's really important to set timed goals for yourself. Things like, I'm going to spend this much time every day, like both short term and long term goals. I'm going to spend this much time every day working on my college application, right? And it could just be writing one line, right? So don't get yourself so worked up that you can't get anything done. Just make really small goals. I'm going to write one sentence every day, related to my college applications or something like those sorts of things. And then also, and stick to it. Don't make the goals so onerous that you don't do them. Everybody
Yeah.
has different thresholds for that. And then make longer term goals. So say, I'm going to decide after 1 year in college whether I really chose the right major. And here's the day on which I'm going to evaluate it and decide, should I switch majors, or did I recognize really what my passion was going in, or did I realize I had a different passion after a year? For the 2 years after graduate school, I'm going to figure out whether I want to go to industry or do a academic postdoc towards being a professor or be a teacher. So set yourself different length goals for different parts of your career and really stick to them, and don't rely on somebody to always tell you the right thing. You need to choose your own goals. If anybody ever offers you help, accept it, right? If somebody says, oh, I'll read your paper for you, take them up on it. That's free.
Yeah.
Never refuse.
Yeah, that's all the questions I had for today. I really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to hear what you're doing.